All right, everyone. Joe Biden deciding to bumble again, this time, as usual, on the U.S. border, admitting that there's a crisis there, coming out saying, well, yeah, I realize that the border is not secure, but then declining to take any personal responsibility for it. And we've seen this messaging before. We saw it from Karine Jean-Pierre, we've seen it from Kamala, we've seen it from Biden himself, blaming the Trump administration for the problems at the U.S. border. So the administration that reigned over record lows in the number of people that needed to be deported because the number of border encounters was so much smaller, that explicitly told people on day one, don't come. They didn't wait like Kamala did and then do nothing about it. That actually attempted to apprehend people, etc., building wall, retrofitting vehicle barriers and so forth with something a bit more beefy, expanding electronic monitoring networks and hiring more agents to actually solve the problem and sort of to ease the strain on the system. That administration somehow is more responsible for the border crisis than, almost 3 years in now, the Biden administration and its own policies. Well, that's not really true, and I think the average person knows that. The thing that's really hurting Biden with this is a lack of proper messaging. The Biden administration has been all over the place. For a couple of years there, they denied that there was a border crisis at all. Well, what crisis? I don't see any stinking crisis. Then all of a sudden they started busing migrants to Martha's Vineyard in Chicago and places like that. And now all of a sudden they have no choice but to acknowledge, oh yeah, there is a problem. But it's the last guy's fault. There was no problem when the last guy was there. It magically rears its ugly head the second that our administration begins. But just trust us, you dumb fucks. I think that the people of Chicago and New York, people certainly at the southern border, etc., I think can see through this particular messaging. But it's much like when Biden is warned by the more intelligent liberal commentators, stop mentioning the goddamn economy, pivot around, talk about Roe v. Wade or something. And I guess they got the memo on that one finally. Talk about, the Republicans being extreme, or make it a referendum on Trump. It fell on deaf ears there for a long time. Crime, another great example. The Biden administration currently pivoting to talking about how the crime rate has marginally fallen off since its height last year. Well, people, again, they're just not feeling it. Just like with inflation in the economy, they go and they buy groceries and pump gas. There's relief year over year, but it's not enough. You would need a prolonged deflationary economy at this point in order to undo the damage that's already been done by Bidenomics, for example. Either that or you have to have at least net zero inflation for an extended period as wages hopefully pick up, but there's no guarantee that that actually happens. But I think on the border, the messaging is the worst. Worse than foreign diplomacy, worse than even on the economy at this point, the border messaging. The Biden administration, for instance, suing the state of Texas. And SCOTUS, by the way, sided with the feds, which I think is a laughingstock. Even Amy Coney Barrett crossed the line to vote with the libs in charge. And of course, John Roberts. It was expected he'd vote with the hyper-liberal justices. He's a neocon, a Bush appointee. Amy Coney Barrett, unfortunately, making the wrong decision on this one, allowing the feds to go in and continue snipping the razor wire along the Texas border supposedly in order to facilitate the rescue of people who are already, they've made it into the country physically. But that's not really what's happening. They're cutting holes in the Texas border in order to allow people to stream in relentlessly, over 10,000 people a day most days now, and rising steadily. If we do not tackle these problems, then down the road, long term, you get a much bigger problem. But Biden's not willing to address it because right now he's pandering to the left wing of the party that wants the border wide open. They believe that any hindrance to people's so-called free movement into the United States is a human rights violation. It's like when they had those border buoys and they kept trying to convince people that migrants were trying to get through them and then drowning, and we found out that was false. It sort of harkens back years ago. You remember when those Haitians were crossing the Rio Grande and the mounted agents there were attempting to prevent them from scrabbling up the bank and trying to corral them? And they had their horses' reins in hand because, they have to steer their horses. And then you got pictures from like the left-wing media saying, oh my God, they were whipping the migrants. This is just like slavery. They're treating these brown people as though they're on a plantation or something. You remember how that was big in the news for like 48 hours before it was debunked? Well, the Biden administration gleefully went along with that line. I mean, the Biden candidacy at the time. and Kamala and all the others gleefully went along with that line that was being peddled by MSNBC and Vox and places like that, the tabloid rags of the left. And I don't understand the messaging. If you're going to acknowledge there's a border crisis years into your asterisk administration, trying to blame the last guy for it ain't going to do too well. They do the same thing on the economy. Well, the inflation is Donald's fault. I've seen right-wing commentators with TDS, they've been claiming that for years. Well, that's interesting, but Trump hasn't been in office for a while. He appears to be the former president / probably future president as opposed to the current steward. Somehow he's responsible, though, for everything that's gone wrong. They've even tried to blame him for Ukraine. Well, Trump was Putin's puppet, and therefore he's responsible for the invasion of Ukraine. He brokered the Afghanistan deal. Yeah, he agreed upon a different date, and people who don't understand Pashtun culture and tradition probably don't get this, but see, he's responsible for that too. It's interesting. We've come a long way since the buck stops here. Now it's the buck stopped before Joe Biden got into office. He's not responsible for literally any of the things going wrong at this particular moment. Again, despite having been in office for several years, it's still the last guy's fault. So if Trump gets into office and an earthquake happens, he can blame Joe Biden, I suppose. If Trump gets into office, 2 years into his Grover Cleveland-esque second term, a war breaks out. Well, it was the last guy, and then he can show clips of Joe Biden blaming Trump for things that happened 5 years after the fact. It'll be very, very interesting. The messaging, though, is just so poor. It almost boggles the mind. Where are his staffers and aides and advisors to tell him to knock this shit off? He shouldn't do the off-the-cuff remarks thing about the border or the economy or foreign diplomacy because it always comes back to haunt him. There's a reason why his approval is so low. And falling, by the way, still. He's very, very close now to tying his all-time gap in polling. There's the gap between the disapproval at the top and the approval at the bottom. He's within 1.5 points of that right now. And things were absolutely dire when that happened before. It happens to be lining up right before the election. Normally, you would expect a swing in the other direction because the general has fundamentally begun. Trump has sealed the deal for the GOP. We know who the nominee will be. Normally, there'd be a narrowing there, but there's no narrowing. We're not seeing that like we normally see in an incumbent presidency or a non-incumbent race. Normally, things start to narrow up. You're getting through January, you're headed on towards February. After Super Tuesday, basically everything's clinched. We'll know exactly what's going to happen in a formulaic sense post that. A few months later, and then you get the general election beginning in fervor with hopefully debates. I'd like to cover those, etc., etc. We're not seeing that traditional narrowing yet. It's still moving in a negative direction for Joe Biden, and I think more than even the problems themselves, so the border crisis, Ukraine, Afghanistan, any of these other things, the Houthi rebels and ships being seized and the border crisis, even more than that, crime, inflation, and so forth, the messaging, the way in which you explain to the American public why it's not your fault or why you're trying your best to solve the problem just has fallen on deaf ears because it's just so poor. Of course, when you look at who the White House press secretary is or who the attack dog VP is, you can sort of understand why the messaging would be particularly poor. That's about all. Peace out.